Good afternoon, everyone. I again am Jonathan Upchurch, and I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for this session. And I need to share a little bit of a backstory with you about this session. As you may remember from yesterday, my wife Betty and I were living here on the South Rim for 6 years. And in, I believe it was 2010, we attended an evening program here in the park. We attended many of them, presented by park rangers. And there was one that after we heard it at the time, we both said to each other, man, that was a really good presentation. Well, now we need to fast forward to the spring of 2023. You've probably heard a lot of chatter recently about pipeline construction at the Grand Canyon, water supply. We have to fix our water supply system. There's this huge $200 million project that's underway now regarding water at the Grand Canyon. And back last spring, they were soliciting presentations for the Grand Canyon History Symposium. So I put two and two together. I remembered that presentation from 2010, and I thought, man, that would really be appropriate to have a presentation about the history of water supply at the Grand Canyon. Who was it who gave that presentation back in 2010? And I looked at Betty and I said, who gave that presentation? And she said, I don't know. Do you know who gave that presentation? So our first challenge was to figure out who was that individual who gave that great presentation. Well, fortunately, I keep something that is called Gigi's phone list here in the park. It's sort of an internal phone list of all park staff. So I pulled out the 2010 version of that phone list, and Betty and I started going through the list. And we go down through there, and Betty says, it was Marge Ullmann who gave that presentation. And Betty says, well, but I'm pretty sure that Marge is no longer at Grand Canyon, and I have no idea where she went. So the next challenge was, how do we track down Marge Ullmann? Well, it was sort of a roll of the dice. I said, well, maybe she still works for the Park Service. If she does, her email address would be, and there's a standard format for anyone who works for the Park Service. I sent off this cold email to someone named Marge Ullmann, explaining why I was getting in touch with her and encouraging her to make a presentation at this symposium. So that's how we got here today. Marge Ullmann is still with the National Park Service. Earlier in her career, she worked first at Grand Canyon, then at Petrified Forest, then back here at the Grand Canyon again, then moved on to the Flagstaff Area Monuments. That would be Sunset Crater, Wapatki, and Walnut Canyon. That's where she works now in administration. Her husband, Richard Ullmann, also works there as head of interpretation for those parks. So I'm very pleased to welcome Marge Ullmann. I'm really looking forward to hearing this presentation again about the history of water supply at the Grand Canyon.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. Cool. So it's been a little while since I've done this, so forgive me if I flub around too much. From the first people to live in the canyon and the earliest pioneers making the canyon their home, water has always been a limiting factor. People, animals, wagons, and trains have all hauled water over the years. Today we use a pipe. But it's still challenging to provide water in a place where the only sources of water are below the canyon rim. It's a place where there are huge elevation changes, there are extreme temperatures, and it's a landscape that makes everything very difficult. In this presentation, I'm going to tell you about water at the canyon and how we've come up with creative, expensive, and even dangerous ways to provide water so that visitors and residents alike can quench their thirst at Grand Canyon. Oh, I'm going to turn it off. I've already got it. Some of you may recognize this picture. This is a pretty famous image. It's the first Santa Fe Railroad passenger train at the South Rim to arrive on September 21st of 1901. But what some people don't notice in this picture is that there's already a water tank there. Early pioneers never really had a dependable source of water up here on the rim until the Santa Fe started hauling that water. There was Roe Well, there were a couple of springs in the canyon people would get things from, but this was the first time that they had a dependable source. Tanker cars provided water for train passengers, hotel guests, laundry, cooking, and the steam engines themselves. At first, they only needed 50 gallons per day per passenger, but very quickly, that was not enough water. When they built El Tovar in 1905, you're going to see a water tank that was also built. 43 foot tall, 23 feet wide, this steel water tank was at the highest point in the village. So once water was pumped up, it could then provide water, particularly at that point, to El Tovar. And at the time they built it, in this tower, it was also a 10,000-gallon storage tank for water. It still had to be pumped up the hill, of course, so they used water in a steam-driven power plant to move the water up to the storage tank, and then it would supply El Tovar. In the early 1900s, this tower provided enough water to serve the facilities in the hotel, including hot and cold running water. In each room, they had a bath on every floor, and it also supplied the kitchen for only $90 a day. This second tower you'll see right here, there's two towers now. This one was built in 1915, probably to supply the rest of the developing village and not just El Tovar. Here's some tanker cars on the railroad tracks there. At first, the railroad would make weekly deliveries of water. In 1917, about 10,000 gallons a day was usually enough to supply water here at the rim. But in the really busy season, they ended up needing 100,000 gallons a day for weeks at a time. So this quickly wasn't enough. And water was not only needed for people, but also to prevent fires, and in a place with wooden buildings as well that could quickly burn if there was a fire. So they needed a little bit more water. In 1927, the Santa Fe Railroad turned to reclaimed water. They built a water reclamation plant here that at that time was the third in the country to reclaim water. They had some collection lagoons below the Bright Angel Lodge. They used that reclaimed water for steam heat, the steam engines, the steam-driven power plant. They used it for irrigation, toilets, and even fire suppression. And we still use reclaimed water today, a lot of it. But let's jump over to the North Rim real quick, because it's part of the story as well. The North Rim at 8,000 feet in elevation, with almost twice as much precipitation as we get here on the South Rim, gets a lot of snow. So you'd think it'd have a lot of water, which when there's snow melts you do, but you don't have a reliable source that they can access year-round. So like the South Rim, it's limited by its water. One of those first water carriers was a pretty famous figure here up at the canyon, is Bridie. Bridie was a burro that was likely abandoned by miners down in the canyon, but he would make his way up to the North Rim in the summer where it was cooler, and he became friends with the McKees. Elizabeth Wiley McKee in 1917 had a camp on the North Rim, and her son Robert's job was to go get water from down in the canyon. He and Bridie would hike down to Transept Canyon several times a day and haul water up. Bridie had these nifty tanks on his back. He could carry up to about 20 gallons at a time. And his reward, he got to unload those tanks in the barrels in the shade, and he got a lot of pancakes as well. In 1927, the Union Pacific Railway won the bid for development at the North Rim, but water was an issue, so that was one of the first things that they addressed. And unlike the Santa Fe Railroad here on the South Rim, they didn't have a rail line that went right up to the rim of the canyon, so they couldn't bring tanker cars with them. So they needed a place to provide a reliable source of water. And so they went down into the canyon to a spring called Roaring Springs. Roaring Springs is 4,000 vertical feet or 4 trail miles below the North Rim. and it's a year-round, very reliable source of a lot of water. It's pretty rare to see a picture of inside Roaring Springs, but this is the cave. It's formed by water filtering through permeable layers of rock until it hits a semi-permeable mauve limestone. And once it hits that limestone, it moves in and out and creates these caves and eventually makes its way out back to the surface. Now, the Union Pacific used a tramway system from the rim of the canyon down to Roaring Springs. They built a series of 3 different tramways to get the heavy equipment and pipe down from the rim to Roaring Springs. They built a pump house, a residence building, and 4 miles of a 3.5-inch steel pipeline. They also built a dam that was just below Roaring Springs to provide electricity that would then pump the water up to the rim. And conveniently, that electricity they could use then to power the Grand Canyon Lodge on the North Rim. So next to the pipeline ran an electrical cable as well. So it served 2 purposes, which was pretty convenient. Here's a picture of the pipeline you can see right here along Roaring Springs. Still used today. Well, that was in 2010. The pipeline could carry 110 gallons per minute up to the North Rim. But this pipe it's still the historic pipe. It's bolted to the rock. It's hanging from cables. It's not buried under the ground, so it'll freeze in the winter, and they have to drain it every winter. So the North Rim closes. A lot of people think it closes just because they get a lot of snow, but it really closes because they don't have water to supply people in the winter. And that would take a lot of storage tanks to do that, and they're not going to do that as well. Now, if they could do this on the North Rim, why not the South Rim? In 1932, the Santa Fe Railroad looked at Garden Creek, 3,200 vertical feet below the rim, 4.5 trail miles down. This is right next to what's now called Havasupai Gardens. And it provided 200,000 gallons of water a day. Well, let's do this. So they used another tramway system that supplied supplies, and it seems like some people got a free ride up and down as well. So they built a pump house down there and a 4.5-mile, 6-inch steel pipeline from Garden Creek at what's now Havasupai Gardens up to the South Rim. Here you can see the pipeline running up through a crevice, a little canyon up there. It also had an electrical line running next to it, but this time instead of a dam at the springs providing the electricity was generated at the rim of the canyon and came down to run the pumps down at the spring itself. It took 9 pumps working in a series of 3s to move water the 3,200 vertical feet out of the canyon. Now, as an aside, in 1987, they actually put in a borehole from the rim down to the canyon. They drilled straight through the rock. It's an 8-inch pipeline in a nitrogen-encased pipe, and it can run year-round with no chance of freezing and very little maintenance because it's completely sealed. Today we have 1 main pump and 2 backup pumps that can push water up at 650 gallons a minute. The main pump is so powerful it can only run at night. And if the backup is used, it has to run 24 hours a day to keep up with water use on the South Rim. But that historic pipeline is still used today. So if you go down into the canyon and you get water on the Bright Angel Trail, it's from that historic pipeline. And just like the North Rim, that pipe is exposed on the rock and has to be drained each winter. So if you are hiking in the winter, you won't find water at those rest houses. Visitation. From the 1932 when they put in that pipeline, this is an early 1950s picture, I believe, it just kept increasing. Water, it wasn't enough. It's always been an issue, and it's in a place where fire is even a bigger issue these days, especially now that we have historic wooden buildings that could potentially burn. So we have to do something about the water and having a reliable source. What's the best, most reliable, largest supply of water at the canyon? That's not the Colorado River. Roaring Springs. So from this side of the canyon, we decided, well, there's already a pumping house, so what if we added some more to the pipeline? So you've got a pump station here, what's now Havasupai Garden, and it goes up to the south rim, and you have access to Roaring Springs over here. So all they had to do was put in a line that went up here, and because of the elevation change, all that water could run by gravity until it got to Indian Garden, Havasupai Gardens, and then it could be pumped up to the rim. Okay. The problem was that 12 and a half miles in between Roaring Springs and the pumping station. In the early 1960s, it was Halverson Lentz who won the contract to build this Transcanyon Pipeline. They used helicopters to haul equipment, pipe, supplies, and the crew in and out of the canyon. At the height of the project, a helicopter left Yaqui Point, which is where this picture was taken, every 3 minutes. At the time, this was the largest helicopter-supported project in the world. It clocked over 25,000 helicopter hours during the project. It hauled everything into the canyon, from the heavy equipment to the pipe. This is a picture of some of the pipe, and they chose aluminum as the pipe itself instead of steel, which would be more durable, because the aluminum was lighter, so the helicopters could actually carry it, and it was bendable. We'll talk about why that's important in a second. The helicopters were also important. They had to be smaller type of helicopters, so they couldn't use a heavy-duty helicopter to carry really heavy stuff because it had to fit in tight places like this. You can see this is a smaller helicopter actually delivering something to a person. See, here's this person right there. Some pretty tight spots. They were very good pilots. And then all the equipment that they used to build the pipeline had to be specially made. They were restricted by the National Park Service within a 4 to 6 foot width for the trail, and they couldn't go much further than that because it would damage natural and cultural resources. So they had to make special equipment like this little guy here that would help them to build that pipeline on the trail as well. The most challenging part, though, was what we call the box inside the canyon. It's really narrow, it's quite long, it's a metamorphic rock, it's really hard, it's really hot. I could just go on and on. But this was the biggest challenge for that. So one solution was to build bridges. So they built bridges from one side to the other, so you no longer had to go walk across the creek itself. And then the bridges were nice because they could actually put the pipeline underneath the bridges themselves. So the pipe, once it was built, some of it would still, though, it couldn't go under the bridge. It might not have been able to fit under the trail. They would still have some of it hanging from cables, all wrapped up and hanging, or they have it propped up on stanchions down at the bottom of the canyon. So creative ways to put this pipe, that 12 and a half miles from Roaring Springs up to the pumping station at Indian Garden. And they had to get it across the Colorado River. So they built the Silver Bridge. You can see here the helicopter and a worker there up on the building the bridge. And if next time you walk under it, I hope you all get down there, you'll see the pipeline running right underneath the Silver Bridge. So it was a great way and an extra way for hikers to go across the canyon as well. But then something happened. The pipeline could, at that point, let me just go back. It was 6-inch aluminum pipe, right? It could carry about 800 gallons a minute, and it cost $2.5 million to build in the early 1960s, and it's $208 million for the new project, just as an FYI. Finishing touches were being put on in November of 1966 when disaster struck. Weather brought in severe storms and rain, causing a 500-year flood. And I'm going to read you a quote. This is from December of 1966, a pictorial report of flood damage by the chief naturalist of the time, James Schock. On December 4th, an unseasonable rain began, sweeping up from the southwest, which in 36 hours dumped 14 inches of water on the north rim. Most of the resultant runoff came down Bright Angel Canyon and canyons to the westward, causing sustained high cresting of floodwaters in the creek, which lashed back and forth across the narrow gorge, tearing out trees, solid ground, and great sections of the Cross Canyon Trail and Pipeline. It washed away campgrounds, comfort stations, sewer and water systems, and destroyed buildings, bridges, and other structures, some of which had stood for nearly 60 years. Imagine this calm creek of today turned into a raging torrent with floodwaters rising over 30 feet, moving boulders the size of automobiles. Managers at Phantom Ranch said the ground trembled as huge boulders were tossed like pebbles in the flooding creek. This is a trail crew bunkhouse. It damaged structures like this and washed out 8.5 miles of the pipeline and left the rest broken. That flood damaged and destroyed all that specialized equipment that they needed when they were building that, within that short, narrow range, when they were building the pipeline. It created a brand new delta from Bright Angel Creek down into the Colorado River. This is Roaring Springs Pump House. Even at Roaring Springs, it created a lot of damage and destroyed that. And of course, the pipeline was busted. It damaged bridges. There were many bridges at that point, destroyed those as well, and washed out the trail that was helping to hold the pipeline. Now, because the insurance companies call this an act of God, I don't know if this would apply today, but in 1966, it was called an act of God. The contractors and the Park Service ended up working together to build it a second time. The second Transcanyon Pipeline was completed in 1970. It was re-engineered with fewer bridges in the box. There were only 4 once it was completed that second time. And as much of the pipe as possible was put under the new sections of the trail. So the company came in, they put the pipe, and the Park Service worked together with them to rebuild the trail. Today's pipeline is wrapped and buried underneath a lot of the trail. It's hanging from sheer cliffs. This is the pipeline hanging from a sheer cliff. And of course, it still goes under the bridges along the box. It's jointed and it's bent. It's considered one of the crookedest pipelines in the world. It actually has a bend every 15 feet. And because of this, the pipeline often breaks. The water pressure is so great through the pipe that the aluminum that they originally used often just gives out under pressure. It wears out and it just cracks and breaks. Sometimes the joints, where they hinge it together, they fail and they break. And sometimes a rock slide, as you know we have at the canyon, will also take out sections of the pipe. And then floods still happen and wash out not only the trail, but it also can wash out the pipeline as well. When this happens, we do have storage tanks here on the South Rim, 13 million gallons of stored water. When the pipeline breaks, though, they immediately put in water restrictions, and I think the estimate was maybe 2 weeks to use these tanks for water conservation. And as far as I know, I don't think they've ever had to close the park because they couldn't get a pipe fixed enough. But if you've been up here long enough, you know it happens quite often. And it's not heavy equipment that's going to repair that pipeline. It's got to still be people, and these are our Park Service crew. We have plumbers here who have technical rappelling skills. This is the dangerous part of our job. And they can't be scared of heights. This guy's on the pipe here, and you can see him over here in this other picture hanging from the pipe. Here's another picture of them working on the pipeline, and I have a few stories that I had gotten from workers then. One of the crew said he was working on a steep cliff using a saw to cut a piece of broken pipe. A rock fell from above, hit his helmet hard enough to crack it, and at that time he dropped the saw, he lost his grip on it, and it fell, and it missed another worker below by just inches. We still use helicopters. This helicopter actually is carrying a welder into the canyon. This one weighs about 600 pounds, actually, so the heavy equipment is still carried into the canyon. And it still carries a pipe as well. Oh, that's another story. So when the helicopter can't get to the break, sometimes the crew also has to walk in to where they're to the break itself. So here's another story. On one of the hikes into a pipeline break, one of the crew was carrying a 50-pound pack and an additional heavy tool bag. They were walking along the edge of Bright Angel Creek. A rock gave way at the edge, and he fell into a deep pool in the creek. He said that it felt like he was in a washing machine because the water was moving so fast. He dropped the tool bag, losing the tools, but it ended up saving his life. He was able to grab onto some vegetation at the side of the pool until others could come along and help him out. Sometimes there's a simple repair. You got an exposed pipe, you cut out the broken part, and then you just seal in a new weld, seal in a new piece of it, right? But sometimes you got to dig down because you want to bury it under the trail to protect it. And you can't use heavy equipment because you're down in the canyon and you're not allowed to use big heavy equipment to do that. So hand digging all around there. Once you get the hole big enough, then sometimes they can just cut the piece away. That piece then is often sent to the rim so that it can be matched exactly. Sometimes the aluminum, you can see on this one too how it has a curve to it. You can just see that little curve. They still have a bending machine that can bend that aluminum pipe to fit just right. So they have to cut it, take it, measure it, fix it, and then take it back down into the canyon. If they can, instead of putting aluminum pipe back, they'll use steel pipe, but there's other issues with that too. And because the pipe, let's say they use steel, so an example, a steel pipe, like a 10-foot section of steel pipe can weigh 600 pounds. So you can't just put that somewhere else and have the people carry it over, right? So the helicopter has to get as close as it can. So you can see this piece of pipe hanging from cable, that's a helicopter above it, trying to get it right to those workers on the side of the hill. And the workers have to stand on these steep cliffs in order to do it. So it's really quite dangerous. The helicopter rotors are going, there's dust and debris. This was probably in a place where there was a rock slide. You have the potential of more rocks coming. So it's really quite dangerous to do that. And then when they're putting the pipe together, they have this intricate pulley system that they use. So they got to go put anchors, they got to use the ropes, they got to use the pulleys. They have to line up the old pipe, they have to line up the new pipe to the old pipe to within 1/8 of an inch before they can do the welding on it. And of course, none of this is on even terrain, right? So, and because the pipeline rarely breaks in the same place again, it's always in a new place. So it's always new anchors and new places that they're having to fix this as well. Once the pipe is in place, it has to be welded together. So they weld it, or they can use we'll just say welded. Sparks require safety equipment that's not made for the extreme heat in the canyon. So you can see our welder here with his mask and stuff on. And so here's a story that they told me as well. So one of the welders, he always put a bandana under it because he's sweating like crazy under there, right? And you got to be able to see what you're doing. So he's got a bandana on. And he said one time the spark must have wrapped around and caught his bandana on fire. And luckily, somebody's always watching, one of the safety protocols, and they were able to put it out. So it's not only was it hot, but it's, just all that danger is there as well. And then once the pipeline is repaired, then they have to blow it out so that it's clean, there's no more debris in it, and then they can pump it and store it as well. So a classic repair would be that the flood damages the trail, washes out the pipe. They come in, they fix the pipe, and then the trail crew comes in and rebuilds a trail in its place. And then, of course, there's maintenance at Roaring Springs in the cave itself. So it's not just the pipeline, but the springs as well. So this is one of our plumbers, if you will, going in. Fine sediment accumulates inside there. So because it's cutting through the rock, all that fine sediment collects, and they have to clean that out because they're taking that water and they're putting it right into the pipe to come up to the rim. So they've even used pool vacuums down in there to clean it out. When I did this program in 2010, at that point, it was the only government-operated and owned water utility that pays for all of its costs, including this expensive repair, through the sale of water. So the next time, if you think your water bill is high, be glad that you don't have to pay a water bill up here. So the next time you take a drink of water from the rim of the canyon, or you fill up while you're down on the trail, remember the journey that this water had to make across the canyon and the Park Service crew that keeps that water flowing. They risk their lives so that we can quench our thirst here at Grand Canyon. Thanks.